Hands! An artist's worst enemy. After years of drawing hands in pockets and behind backs, I think it's finally time to face my fear and properly learn how to draw hands. And you can too. I'm gonna do an intensive hand drawing boot camp, and once I'm done, I'm gonna challenge myself to draw a hand from imagination. I'll make sure to explain what I learned and the exercises I did, so maybe you can learn alongside me. Let's see how that goes. So when I want to learn how to draw a specific body part, I generally use the same approach. I start by simplifying it into basic shapes before learning any complicated anatomy, so that's what I'm going to do today. I'll start with the palm, which I think of as some kind of squishy, bendy box. It's a little flexible, so it can be almost completely flat, or it can make a slightly arched shape, like this. If we look at the top of the palm, the part where the fingers meet the palm also makes an arc shape. Personally, I find that trying to draw both of these arches at once is pretty hard, but I try my best anyway. Not too hard so far, right? Hopefully. But obviously, the palm isn't what most people struggle with. Let's dive into the part that causes the most problems. I'm talking, of course, about the fingers. The hard part about fingers is that there are so many things you can get wrong. You need to make sure the fingers are the right shape, you need to make sure they're the right length relative to each other, and you also need to make sure that the knuckles are in the right place and the fingers are bending in the right direction. But don't panic. Let's tackle these one at a time. I'm going to be using this really cool hand model I may have impulse purchased a while back. I left a link in the description if you want to check it out. Like I mentioned earlier, at the top of the palm here where the fingers come out, it's a bit of an arch shape. And this arch shape is echoed throughout the hand. Since the fingers themselves are also different lengths, the tips of the fingers also form an arch shape. But it's not only here. If you pay attention to the positions of the knuckles, they also form these shapes as well. But for now, let's focus on the individual fingers themselves. If you take a look at your own fingers, the first instinct would be to draw them as cylinder shapes, right? And for the longest time, I did just that. But there is one major problem with this. And what is that? To find out, let's take a closer look at the knuckles. Notice that the knuckles are actually hinge joints. That means they can only bend in one specific direction. If you don't pay attention to this direction, your hands are just not really gonna look like hands. So then which direction can they actually bend in? Towards the palm, right? But that's not the entire story. One important thing to keep in mind is that unless they're in a very specific pose, fingers are not parallel. The fingers radiate outwards, so they bend inwards a bit. So if you use cylinder shapes for the fingers, you can't really tell the orientation of the finger clearly, and it's not clear which direction they should bend in. So what shape should we use instead?
I guess this is okay. I mean, it's not really about boxes.
How about boxes?
I give up.
If you use boxes, it keeps the orientation of the fingers very clear, and it makes it obvious which way it should bend. I think Taco does a really good job stylizing fingers as boxes, so I decided to find a bunch of his drawings and copy them to try to understand it better myself. Great! But I still haven't covered the weirdest and hardest part of the hand to draw, in my opinion. And by that, I mean, of course, the thumb. But why is the thumb so hard to draw? It looks a little different, but it's mostly just another finger, right? Just shorter. Not exactly. Yeah, sure, the shape is different and it also has one fewer joint than the other fingers, but that's not the hard part. Look at the range of motion the thumb has. Now, opposable thumbs are an incredible evolutionary trait that allows us to grasp and hold things. This is amazing for humans, but not so great for artists because it's kind of really hard to draw. Although I guess it's pretty cool that it lets us hold pencils. In particular, pay attention to the direction that the thumb joint can bend. You can tell the direction it bends in by looking for the fingernail or thumbnail, which also applies for the other fingers. Then the thumb is attached with a big pad of muscle and fat. I usually draw it as a kinda squishy blob that comes out from the palm. So now that I have a basic understanding of the shape of the hand, it's time to practice. But what kind of practice exactly? For me, I find it effective to find a bunch of references and try to break these references down into basic shapes. As for where you can find these references, there are plenty to be found on the internet. But also remember the ones that you hopefully have attached to your own arms. Don't be like me and forget that you have these and end up spending a lot of money on a very expensive plastic version of them. I mean, I love this thing though. But anyway, I look at these references and I try to break them down into basic shapes. And I did this a bunch of times until I felt comfortable. And depending what you want to draw, this actually might be enough. If you primarily like to focus on drawing full body characters, just getting the right shape is likely good enough. In fact, you probably only need to memorize a few basic hand poses and keep using those. But what if that's not enough? What if you want to draw compelling illustrations where the hands are the focal points? At this point, you'll have to start learning more in-depth anatomy. Of course, even if you do want to draw detailed hands, you still need to make sure that you have the basic shapes down. Because if your base doesn't look right, it doesn't matter how many details you add on top, it's still gonna look weird. We'll start by examining the shape of the palm in a little bit more detail. And the most obvious things are the muscle and fat pads here on the thumb and pinky side. But don't forget there's also a little pad right below the fingers, which forms a kind of ring shape on the palm. On the back of the palm, we of course have the tendons radiating out from the wrist. And by the way, for some reason, somehow, I actually never realized there's a thumb tendon until literally, well, right now. You learn something every day. Now let's take a closer look at the shape of the fingers. Remember how I said that they weren't sausages and they were more like box shapes? Well, they're actually something in between that. If you look at the cross-section of the fingers, the tops of the fingers are quite flattened, where they're mostly bony. The bottom has a bit more meat, so it's more rounded. As for the thumb is a kind of weird shovel shape that's a bit different to all the other fingers. It's a lot of extra information, but like before, I decided to try to drill that information into my head by drawing from reference. But sometimes, even if you get all the anatomy right, the hand drawing still doesn't look good. It looks awkward? So what's missing? It could be that the drawing lacks gesture. If you're familiar with gesture drawing, those are the swooshy, quick drawings that people do to capture the energy and motion of a pose. The same thing actually applies to hands. Hands are very complicated things that have energy and flow and lots of poses as well. One way I like checking for the flow of the hand is to make sure that the fingertips and knuckles link up in a smooth line. This doesn't always work, depending on the pose, but it's nice to keep in mind. So now that I've done all this practice, am I ready for the final challenge? Can I draw a hand from imagination using no reference at all? Well, okay, not exactly, because remember, I can always look at my hands if I need to. I think it's fair to use something that I always have at hand. Get it? No, don't include that. Or do? I don't know. I start by doing some rough sketches before quickly settling on an idea where the hand was reaching out towards the viewer. I made sure to include some foreshortening because obviously I didn't want to make it too easy for myself. I drew a box for the palm and some quick sausages to figure out the gesture of the hand pose before constructing the fingers out of boxes. At this stage, I'm not trying to figure out the anatomical details just yet. I'm just trying to make sure that my hand pose makes sense. I spend a lot of time doing funny things with my other hand and looking at it. When I'm happy with it, I start adding some more detailed anatomy, but hang on, wait. It kinda doesn't look quite right. What's wrong? Take a look at the proximal phalanges, which is the bit of the finger closest to the palm. See how bent back they are? That seems pretty uncomfortable. I fruitlessly tried to fix it without having to redraw it, but I think it was beyond saving. So sadly, I just scrap it and start over, this time making extra sure to draw the fingers correctly in perspective. When I was happy with it, I cleaned up the line art, then colored and shaded it. When shading, I took extra care to make sure to use shading to express the form of the hand properly, especially all those subtle bumps that I spent all that time studying. And here's the final results. What do you think? I mean, it's not perfect, of course, but given my current skill level, I don't think I did too badly. I think I could have improved the silhouette and form drawing of the individual fingers, but I'll probably need to practice more before I'm able to do that. I do like how the hand seems to be properly reaching out towards the viewer, like it's in 3D space though. Anyway, I hope this video was at least a little bit useful for you. If you want to check out the books I used for this, or the cool hand model, there are links in the description. If you enjoyed it, draw the subscribe button with hands on it. Anyway, I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!